History doesn't bury its darkest stories. It just stops talking about them. This is the dark annals, where medicine, history, and darkness meet. I'm your narrator, and tonight we go back 8,000 years ago. Imagine waking up, and the first thing you feel is a hole in your skull. Not a wound from a battle, not an accident. Someone put it there, deliberately, carefully, and you survived. Now imagine this. It was the kindest thing anyone could do for you. This is the story of trepanation, the oldest surgical procedure ever performed by human hands. Older than writing, older than recorded civilization, a practice so ancient and yet so sophisticated that when modern scientists first discovered the evidence, they refused to believe it was intentional. Welcome to the Dark Annals. I'm your narrator, and tonight we drill into the past. Act 1, the discovery that shocked science. In 1865, a French surgeon and archaeologist named Paul Broca was examining a collection of prehistoric skulls excavated from burial sites across Europe and South America. Broca was already famous. He had recently identified Broca's area, the region of the brain responsible for speech. But what he found in that collection would disturb him in a different way entirely. Several of the skulls had holes in them. Clean, rounded holes, some as small as a coin, others large enough to fit 3 fingers. And these weren't fractures from combat or accidents. The edges of the holes were smooth, polished, and crucially, in many of the skulls, the bone had begun to regrow around the opening. These people had survived. Someone had cut into their skulls while they were alive, and they had lived long enough for their bones to start healing. Broca initially couldn't accept what he was seeing. The implication was extraordinary, that prehistoric humans, people without metal tools, without written knowledge, without any formal understanding of anatomy, had been performing brain surgery thousands of years before the ancient Greeks, thousands of years before the Roman Empire, thousands of years before anyone thought such a thing was possible. He published his findings cautiously. The scientific community received them with profound skepticism. Surely, critics argued, these holes had another explanation. Natural erosion, perhaps, animal damage, post-mortem ritual mutilation of already dead skulls. But Broca had anticipated those objections, and over the next century, as more and more skulls were excavated from sites on every inhabited continent, the evidence became impossible to deny. Trepanation was real, it was ancient, and it was widespread beyond anything anyone had imagined. Act 2. How old and how far? The oldest confirmed trepanned skull we have found so far dates to approximately 6,500 BCE. That's over 8,000 years ago. It was discovered in a Neolithic burial site in France, and the individual had survived the procedure. This wasn't an isolated case. Sites across France, Spain, Portugal, and Germany have yielded dozens of trepanned skulls from the same era. But Europe was not the epicenter. South America, particularly the Andean cultures of what is now Peru, produced some of the most remarkable evidence ever found. In the Paracas region and its sites associated with the later Inca Empire, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of trepanned skulls, some individuals showing evidence of multiple separate procedures throughout their lifetime. Let that register for a moment. Multiple brain surgeries in pre-Columbian South America with stone and copper tools, and the survival rates were staggering. Studies of Peruvian skulls suggest that in some periods up to 90% of trepanation patients survived long enough to show significant bone regrowth. For context, trepanation performed by European surgeons during the American Civil War, 3,000 years later, had a mortality rate of around 60 to 70%. The ancient Andean surgeons, working with far more primitive tools, were achieving better outcomes than trained military physicians in the 19th century. How? The honest answer is, we don't fully know. Part of it was likely technique. Part of it was the nature of the cases being treated. And part of it may have been something as simple and powerful as experience. Communities passing down hard-won surgical knowledge across generations, long before it was ever written down. Outside of South America and Europe, evidence of trepanation has been found in North Africa, across sub-Saharan Africa, in Russia, China, Melanesia, and among native peoples of North America. This was not the invention of one culture that spread outward. Multiple separate human civilizations, independently, arrived at the same radical idea, that sometimes, to heal the body, you had to open the skull. Act 3. The tools and the methods. Now let's talk about how this was actually done. Because the mechanics of ancient trepanation are both more sophisticated and more disturbing than most people expect. Archaeological and ethnographic evidence suggests 4 main techniques were used across different cultures and periods. The first was scraping, using a sharp stone or obsidian blade to progressively thin the skull bone until it was possible to carefully remove a disc-shaped piece. This was slow and required enormous patience and precision to avoid breaking through to the meninges, the protective membranes around the brain, prematurely. The second technique was grooving, cutting a series of intersecting grooves into the skull in a square or rectangular pattern, weakening the bone until the central piece could be lifted free. Evidence of this method has been found extensively in Neolithic European sites. The third was boring using a pointed implement, sometimes rotated between the palms like a primitive drill, to make a series of holes around the perimeter of the intended opening. The bone between the holes would then be cut through, allowing the section to be removed. And the fourth, found primarily in Peruvian sites, was sawing. Using small serrated implements, surgeons would cut directly into the skull in straight lines, removing a rectangular or polygonal section of bone. What was used for anesthesia and antisepsis? This is where the historical record becomes more speculative, but not entirely silent. Andean cultures had access to coca leaves, the plant from which cocaine is derived, which could be applied topically to numb tissue. There is evidence from at least some Andean sites that chicha, a fermented corn beverage, was used as a sedative. Surgical instruments appear in many cases to have been heated or treated with plant-based compounds with antimicrobial properties. None of this was modern medicine. But none of it was nothing either. These were not random acts of violence against an unconscious person. These were considered medical procedures, carried out by individuals who had almost certainly performed them before, on patients who had likely agreed to undergo them. The question that naturally follows is, why? What conditions were ancient trepanation surgeons trying to treat? Act 4. The reasons behind the holes. This is where medicine, anthropology, and belief systems become tangled in ways that are difficult to fully separate. And that is itself an important truth about ancient medicine. The most straightforward explanation for many cases is trauma. Ancient human life involved regular exposure to head injuries, from warfare, from hunting accidents, from falls. A skull fracture with bone pressing against the brain could cause seizures, paralysis, altered consciousness, and death. Removing the damaged bone fragment could, in the right circumstances, relieve pressure and save the patient's life. This is not fundamentally different from what modern neurosurgeons do today in cases of epidural hematoma, bleeding between the skull and the brain that creates dangerous intracranial pressure. Studies of pre-Columbian Peruvian skulls have found a striking correlation. Trepanation sites cluster in exactly the locations where the blade of an opponent's weapon, specifically a club used in Andean warfare, would most commonly strike the skull. In other words, the surgeons of ancient Peru were opening skulls in precisely the locations where the worst combat injuries occurred. This was battlefield medicine, hard-won and systematically practiced. But trauma cannot explain all the cases. Many trepanned skulls show no evidence of prior injury at the site of the surgery. Here, we enter more uncertain territory. Ethnographic records from cultures that practiced trepanation into the modern era, including populations in parts of Kenya, Algeria, and the Melanesian Islands, provide a window onto the reasoning that may have motivated ancient surgeons. In many of these accounts, trepanation was performed to release evil spirits believed to be trapped inside the skull, causing headaches, epilepsy, madness, or persistent pain. The opening in the bone was the exit route for whatever malevolent force was afflicting the patient. From a modern perspective, we might be tempted to dismiss this as superstition standing in for genuine understanding. But consider epilepsy, severe migraines, psychotic episodes, and behavioral changes caused by undiagnosed brain tumors or abscesses. These were real conditions affecting real people. Ancient practitioners didn't have the conceptual framework of neurons, synapses, or intracranial pressure. What they had was observation. Patients who were suffering in ways that were invisible. No wound, no fever, no visible cause. And a procedure that sometimes, apparently, made them better. Perhaps the spirit model and the pressure model were not as far apart as they seem. Both identified the skull as the problem site. Both proposed that something needed to come out. Act 5. The bone disc and its mysteries. One of the most unsettling discoveries associated with ancient trepanation is what was done with the removed bone. Circular or polygonal discs of human skull bone have been found at archaeological sites across Europe and South America, sometimes near the excavated skulls they came from, sometimes in entirely different locations, sometimes showing signs of having been worn as pendants or amulets, with holes drilled through them for suspension on a cord. In Neolithic European sites, these bone discs have been found buried with individuals who were clearly of high status, placed near the head or held in the hand as grave goods of apparent value. In some South American contexts, they appear to have been kept as protective talismans. What did these discs mean to the people who kept them? Were they trophies? Sacred objects carrying the power of a near-death experience? Protective charms made potent by their contact with the most vulnerable and mysterious part of the human body? We cannot know. But the fact that these objects were preserved, carried, worn, and buried alongside the living and the dead suggests that trepanation was not simply a medical procedure in the narrow modern sense. It was an event of profound significance, a threshold crossing between ordinary life and something else. The bone removed from the skull was not discarded. It was kept as though it still held something of the person it had come from. Act 6. Into the historical record. As human civilization developed writing, trepanation moved from the purely archaeological record into the written one, and the picture that emerges is both more detailed and, in some ways, more troubling. The Hippocratic Corpus, the collection of ancient Greek medical texts attributed to Hippocrates and his followers, written roughly between 400 and 300 BCE, contains an entire treatise on head injuries. It describes trepanation in careful detail, outlining indications for the procedure, contraindications, technical approaches, and the timing of surgery relative to injury. What is striking about the Hippocratic approach is its pragmatism. The ancient Greek physicians were not performing trepanation to expel spirits. They were performing it to remove bone fragments, relieve compression, and drain accumulated blood and fluid. Their understanding was incomplete by modern standards, but the mechanistic reasoning is recognizable. This was medicine in the sense we would understand it. The Roman physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century CE, further refined surgical technique, describing specialized instruments including the modiolus, a crown-shaped trephine bit that could be rotated to cut a neat circular disc of bone, while a built-in guard prevented the instrument from plunging too deep into the brain. Medieval Islamic physicians, building on Greco-Roman knowledge, continued to refine both the indications and the techniques for trepanation. The great Persian physician Avicenna, writing in his Canon of Medicine in the early 11th century, described the procedure with a precision that would not be substantially improved upon in Europe for several hundred more years. And yet, throughout all of this sophistication, all of these careful descriptions, all of this accumulated technique, the fundamental act remained unchanged from the Neolithic. A human being, a sharp instrument, a hole in the skull. The oldest surgery in the world, persisting across 8,000 years of human history, across every major civilization, across every religious and philosophical tradition. Act 7. The dark side. When trepanation went wrong, we should not romanticize this. For every skull that shows bone regrowth, every patient who survived, the archaeological record also preserves the other kind of evidence. Skulls with trepanation holes that show no healing whatsoever. Patients who died on the table or within hours or days of the procedure. In some Neolithic European sites, the mortality rates suggested by skeletal evidence appear quite high, particularly in the earlier periods, when techniques were likely less refined. The high survival rates found in some Peruvian samples appear to represent a peak of technical mastery achieved over many generations. Not all practitioners were equally skilled. Not all cultures had accumulated the same depth of experience. There is also evidence, disturbing and difficult to interpret, that trepanation was sometimes performed on individuals who had no medical need for it. Children's skulls have been found with trepanation evidence, skulls showing no trauma, no pathology, no obvious clinical indication. Whether these represent ritual procedures, experimental operations, punishments, or something else entirely, we cannot say with certainty. In later historical periods, trepanation fell in and out of favor as medicine evolved. Sometimes overused by practitioners who believed it could cure almost any condition of the head or mind, sometimes avoided entirely as too dangerous. In early modern Europe, Traveling surgeons sometimes advertised trepanation as a treatment for epilepsy, madness, and persistent headaches, conditions for which it offered no reliable benefit and for which the risks were substantial. One of the most haunting accounts comes from the 16th century French surgeon Ambroise Paré, who described patients brought to him by desperate families. After incompetent surgeons had performed poorly executed trepanations, leaving fragments of bone in contact with the brain or breaching the dura mater, the thick membrane protecting brain tissue, causing infections that killed within days. Paré tried to repair what he could. Often he could not. The patients died in pain, infected, betrayed by men who had the instruments and the boldness for surgery, but not the knowledge or the care. Act 8. The modern echo. Today, trepanation, in its modern form called a craniotomy or craniectomy, is a routine neurosurgical procedure. It is performed to treat traumatic brain injuries, remove tumors, clip aneurysms, drain hematomas, and relieve intracranial pressure. Modern surgeons use pneumatic drills and precision imaging. The patient is under general anesthesia. A sterile operating room surrounds them. Every step is guided by a century of accumulated medical science. And yet, the fundamental act, drilling through the human skull to access the brain beneath, is identical to what a Neolithic surgeon did in France 8,000 years ago with a piece of obsidian. This continuity is worth sitting with. Modern medicine likes to present itself as a sharp break from the past, as something categorically different from what came before. And in many ways it is. The germ theory of disease, the discovery of anesthesia, the development of antibiotics, these represent genuine revolutions in human understanding. But trepanation reminds us that the impulse to intervene, to cut, to relieve pressure, to try to fix what is broken inside the skull, that impulse predates all of it by thousands of years. The ancient surgeon and the modern neurosurgeon are separated by almost everything and connected by this one thing. There is something else, the archaeological record tells us, something that tends to get lost in the clinical analysis. In many of the Neolithic burial sites where trepanned skulls have been found, the individuals were buried with care, with grave goods, with objects that suggest status and community recognition. These were not people abandoned after a dangerous procedure. They were people who had undergone something significant, who had survived, and who were honored for it. We don't know their names. We don't know what they believed about what had been done to them or what they saw in the hands of the person who held the instrument above their skull. We don't know if they were afraid, but their bones remember. And in the smooth, healed edges of those ancient holes, there is evidence of something that looks, from 8,000 years away, a great deal like the intention to heal. That's the story of trepanation. 8,000 years of human beings cutting into each other's skulls with stone and copper and bronze and steel in the hope that it would help. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. And in that uncertainty, in that gap between what ancient practitioners knew and what they needed to know, lies one of the most profound stories in the history of medicine. Next time on The Dark Annals, we move deeper into the ancient world, to the plagues that dismantled empires, the physicians who tried to understand them, and the patients who had no choice but to trust in both gods and men. If this episode reached you, if it made you think, share it with someone else who would appreciate a story told honestly, from the darkest corners of our history. I'll see you in the archives.